Jesus for the cleansing power. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
The apostles at this particular time, here they are, they've seen Jesus Christ raised from the dead. They've seen Him, of course. They've been walking with Him for many days. Jesus Christ is getting ready to go back to heaven. And what are they asking? They're seeking, but even then they're asking, is this the time that you are going to bring about the kingdom of Israel? Some people, even the apostles, didn't know what they were looking for. They were seeking. They thought that they were looking for an earthly kingdom, that Jesus was going to come and have a throne here on this earth. They were confused. And Jesus, of course, would have to teach them the right way. Many followers came who were seekers, who wanted the truth about the kingdom, and that's exactly what Jesus Christ was going to give them. Many, of course, were sinners, and they came asking for forgiveness. Now, don't get me wrong. Each and every follower, each and every one of us are sinners. As we talked about this morning, we have separated ourselves from the Lord with our actions, because whenever we sin, we fall short, of course, of the glory of God. But there were some who knew. They absolutely knew that they were sinners, and even the rest of the world knew that they were sinners. I'm mindful of Luke chapter 7, the woman who barges into that meal. Simon the Pharisee has asked Jesus to come over to his house. He's dining there, and this woman barges in and starts crying on his feet, taking her hair and wiping his feet and then pouring perfume on his feet. And the Pharisee is like, if you only knew who she was. She's a sinner. We don't know what kind of sinner she was, but she was a sinner, and she knew that she was a sinner, and she came asking for forgiveness. But then there's also the skeptics, or you might even say the scoffers, individuals who are following in order to hear something, hear some proof from Jesus Christ. Some of them would want to hear proof that He is indeed the Messiah. Some of them weren't necessarily looking for proof for that. Some of them were looking for proof justifying themselves for putting Him to death. If we hear Him blaspheme, if we hear that He says that He is the Son of God, then we can put Him to death. They never were going there to believe. They were skeptics. They were scoffers. And then there was the self-righteous, those who came saying, justify me. When I think of a self-righteous individual who's looking for justification for his life, I'm mindful of the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler, of course, came to Jesus, and what was he looking for? He was looking for justification. He was a good young man. He came, he's following all of the law. Jesus looks at him and says, this is what you have to do. Sell all that you have, give to the poor, and then come follow me. And that's not what he was looking for. He was looking for justification. He was looking for Jesus to look at him and say, you're all right. Everything about your life is great. Come as you are and don't change anything about it. And how many of us do the exact same thing? How many times do we just look for justification? We don't want Jesus to change our life. We just want justification for what we're doing, and so that we can stay this way. Well, there were indeed those who were self-righteous and wanted justification. There is indeed a group of individuals who are following Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 18 who fit under this particular category of the self-righteous, those who are wanting justification. Look at verse 9. Luke chapter 18 and verse 9. It says, and He also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. What do we have here? We have some people who are wanting justification, and their problem is twofold. The first problem that they have is that they were righteous in their own eyes. We've seen individuals like this. We've seen the individuals who are very, very self-righteous. They think that they have indeed arrived. I've done everything correctly, and there's nothing better that I can do. They have arrived. There's a terrible byproduct to this particular mindset with yourself, and that is the second part of this twofold problem, and that is that they viewed others with contempt. If someone views that they have arrived, they tend to start looking at others and saying, but you haven't. You haven't arrived. You haven't arrived where I have arrived. If you want to arrive, if you want to be someone as good as me, here's my resume, here's what I have done, and you need to follow me. These individuals, they were righteous in their own eyes. They viewed others with contempt. And you marry these two problems together, and what do you have? You have one word. You have pride. These individuals had a pride problem. It was all about them. They were exalting themselves. And my goodness, Jesus had some prideful people in his day. Jesus Christ had the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, these religious individuals who thought that they were fulfilling the old law perfectly, and they would look at others with contempt, and they hated other individuals. Let's bring up that sinning woman again who came into Simon's house. Simon was very, very upset at Jesus that he would allow such a woman as this to come into his house. Why? Because of pride in his life. When the Pharisees and Sadducees, whenever the people, the Jews, saw that Jesus Christ was dining with Matthew and his friends, what did they do? Why is he dining with tax collectors and with sinners? That's pride right there. When Jesus went to the house of Zacchaeus, what did the people start doing? They were grumbling. Why? Because of pride, because they were self-righteous and they viewed others with contempt as well. I'm so thankful that we in the 21st century have evolved. I'm so thankful that we don't have a pride problem anymore. I'm so thankful that the church and our communities in our United States of America, we don't have to deal with pride anymore, do we? Of course, I say this sarcastically, because from the beginning of mankind, hasn't this been the problem? Hasn't this been your problem and my problem? Think about Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve sinned in taking of that forbidden fruit. Why did they take of that forbidden fruit? Because they thought that if they partake of this fruit, they will become like God. Pride. And then whenever things went south for them, whenever they got kicked out of the garden, whenever God came to them saying, I knew all along what you were doing, what did they do? They started having contempt for one another and for that serpent. That woman you gave me, she made me do it. Or that serpent, he made me do it. Pride. Pride from the beginning of time, and pride for you and I as well. And pride left unchecked will cause harm for you, and it will cause harm for everyone that you're around. Do you have pride in your life? Do you have problems admitting when you're wrong? Do you have a problem with saying, I'm sorry, I have messed up? Do you have a problem stooping to someone's level? And whenever I'm saying stooping to someone's level, it's not really stooping to someone's level, but in your mind, you think that you are higher than them, and you have to get down on their level to teach them the gospel, or just to be a friend to them. You know, there might be some individuals who have a prejudice, a racial prejudice, but I think in the church sometimes we still very much have a class prejudice. Maybe not necessarily as much a racial prejudice, but a class prejudice. You're not in my class. You're not in my pay grade. I'm going to treat you less. That's pride. And we have a hard time with that, and we need to make sure that we get rid of this in our life. There's an amazing part to Jesus with his ministry. Think about this for a minute. Think about any athlete. Think about a politician. Think about anyone that if you see someone that is well known, some sort of a celebrity, what do we immediately want to do? We want to run up to them, take their picture, talk with them. And oftentimes they're very nice. Oftentimes they're very, very kind to you. But do they really have the time to stop and talk with you and spend a lot of time conversing with you? No, they've got busy lives as well. Jesus, though, he had thousands of followers. And the amazing part about Jesus' ministry, this 3+ years of ministry, he would stop and he would talk to his followers. Whenever there was a problem, he would stop and he would talk about that problem. Whenever there was a question, he would stop and answer that question. And here is no different. Here in Luke chapter 18, he's got these people around him who have pride and they're looking for justification in their life. So what does he do? He stops and he teaches them. He would teach in many different ways. He would just command. He would use a sermon. But here he uses a parable. And what is a parable? We all know what a parable is, where Jesus uses an earthly illustration to convey a heavenly truth. Sometimes they're very, very figurative. Sometimes they're like the sower went out to plant seed. But sometimes they're very, very literal. And we have a very, very literal parable right here. So let's look at this story that's going to convey pride and how to and who has pride and how we should, of course, get rid of pride. There's two characters in our study, in our parable. The first character is going to be the Pharisee. So read along with me in verse 11 and verse 12. It says, the Pharisee, in this parable, the Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all I get. This man had some pride. This man was very thankful to himself. This man wanted to make sure that the rest of the world knew exactly who he was. And whenever the outside world looked at him, guess what they saw? They saw an outwardly righteous individual. But unfortunately, being outwardly righteous or having an outward appearance of righteousness can be very deceiving, can't it? Matthew chapter 23 and verse 27 says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like a whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all unclean. This man, this Pharisee, he looked good. He looked the part. Everything was right with him. But what was his inside like? What was his soul like? Notice some of the things that he's doing here in verses 11 and 12. Well, first off, he's, of course, praying. The parable is conveying that he's praying out to the Lord, and really where everyone can hear him. He's praying. That's a wonderful thing. He's fasting, he says. I fast twice a week. Fasting is a good thing, isn't it? Where you're giving up a time of food in order to get closer to the Lord. That's a wonderful thing. And what else is he doing? He's giving. He's giving to the poor. All these actions are wonderful things that this Pharisee is doing. But what's his motive? Why is he praying? Why is he fasting? Why is he giving to the poor? Well, we see in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, another account from the Sermon on the Mount. It says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. Keep your finger here at Luke chapter 19. I actually decided I want to go ahead and go over to Matthew chapter 6. We'll come over back to Luke chapter 19 here in a minute. But I want you to see a few of these verses right here because I find it interesting, a wonderful parallel between the parable here in Luke chapter 18 and the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. Because what are the three things that this Pharisee is doing? He's praying, he's fasting, he's giving. Well, look at verse 5 of Matthew chapter 6. When you pray, that's a good thing, you should be doing it, but when you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. If you want people to look at you and go, look at that prayer, that's an amazing prayer. That's exactly what they were doing, and they got their reward, but they didn't receive their reward with their heavenly Father in heaven. Go down to verse 16. What about fasting? Fasting is a wonderful thing. Christians should participate and should practice in this to grow closer to the Lord with their devotion to the Lord, but not in this motive. Verse 16, whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face, as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. If we go about fasting and we decide to start taking some selfies and putting them on social media with droopy faces saying, I haven't eaten in 2 days and I'm hungry, but I'm doing this for the Lord. Am I getting my reward? I'm getting my reward by how many likes I get on Facebook, right? But I'm not getting my reward from the Lord. This is between myself and the Lord. What is my motive? Go back to verse 2, because what else did this Pharisee do? He gave, right? Another good thing. Verse 2, so when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. What is Jesus describing with all of these three commandments? He's describing hypocrites who are very prideful. People who are doing good things, but for the wrong reason. And that's exactly what this Pharisee is doing over, and go back to Luke chapter 11, he's doing all of this to be noticed by men. He's got pride in his life. But there's another character in our parable. There's a second character, and that is the tax collector. Tax collectors were hated. We, of course, have already talked about Zacchaeus and Matthew, tax collectors. These individuals were known, of course, not only to go and take money that Rome required for them to take, but to take more, to cheat the people out in order to be wealthy themselves. They were hated. And here's a tax collector right here, and look at verse 13. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but he was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I don't see a prideful individual there in verse 13. I see instead a penitent individual, someone who has decided that who I am, I don't want to be anymore, and please forgive me, allow me to repent of my sins and change. Please give me mercy. Give me help. Help me change. Help me be a better man because I don't like who I have become. We see a penitence right here. This is the individual who knows that he sinned. We've all sinned. The Pharisee sinned. This man sinned. But this man knew that he sinned. And he goes to God with penitence instead of pride and asks for forgiveness and asks for mercy and asks for a change and asks for help. Read along with me in verse 14. You'll remember before we do so, who went looking for justification? Was it the tax collector and his sins just justify me the way that I am? Or was it the man with pride? Was it the Pharisee? He was the one going and looking for justification, just as these individuals who were following Jesus on that day. So look at verse 14. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. This man was the one who was justified. This man was the one who was justified in his actions. He could walk away from that particular time a happy individual, knowing that the Lord had accepted him and had accepted who he was because he was penitent instead of proud. Where do we fit in this? We find, I believe, in this parable that Jesus has no use for the proud, but he has every use for the penitent soul. He has every use for the sinner who says, I'm done sinning. I cannot go on my own. I need the help of someone else. I need the help of the only one who can give me mercy. I need the help of Jesus Christ. Maybe as you're reading through this particular parable with me this evening here in Luke chapter 18, maybe you're examining your life as we all should be examining our lives. And maybe you're wondering, is this me? And maybe you're starting to consider that maybe you have a pride issue yourself. You're doing wonderful things for the Lord. You're helping the Westhill congregation out tremendously. You're helping your neighbor. You're doing all these wonderful things. But what is it for? Is it for God? Is it for your brothers and sisters in Christ? Is it for the kingdom? Or is it for that bravo? Is it for that like on Facebook or that share on Twitter? What is it for? What are you doing the good things for? And I believe all of us have and maybe are struggling with this at some point in our life. And what do we need to do? We need to check our heart. We need to check our motive. I know that Jesus understood that we would have this issue, which is why he preached on this. I love how in Luke chapter 10, you'll remember in Luke chapter 10, Jesus sends those 70 disciples out. And they go out and they come back and they report to Jesus all the good that has happened. And they are shocked to find that even the demons are responding to them. The demons are responding to them whenever they cast them out in the name of Jesus Christ. And they're so excited about this. And Jesus himself is even excited about it as well. But then he gives a warning. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 20, he says, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. If we're doing good works, as these 70 disciples were doing good works, we're going to see results. These disciples, they saw wonderful results, and they're starting to get excited. Wow, God is using me. And Jesus says, yes, he is, but don't take too much stock in that. Be thankful to God that he's sending you to heaven. So whenever you are doing good things, you're going to see results. Don't take too much pride, too much stock in the fact that you're the individual, you're the vehicle that God is using in order to get these good things done. Instead, be thankful that you're going to heaven, that your name is logged in the book of life, and that you're helping others, or God is using you to get others to heaven as well. Take yourself out of it. It's nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with Jesus Christ, and it has everything to do with how he loves you, and he wants you to get to heaven. We need to take pride out of everything that we do. If we are realizing this evening that we have pride in our life and that we want this pride to leave us, what should we do? We need to act like this tax collector. And how can we do this? 2 quick points for us this evening. Number one, we like the tax collector, must become dependent on God. The Pharisee was dependent upon himself. He's dependent on his good works. But here, the tax collector was dependent on God, realizing that he could not save himself at all. We must realize that without him, we are nothing. Isn't this sometimes hard to do in a nation full of self-starters? In a nation that is promoting the American dream all the time, and nothing wrong with being someone who is owning a business or succeeding in education or succeeding in anything in your life. Nothing wrong with that. But in our nation, this nation of pride, sometimes this is difficult to do because sometimes we feel like, I built this house, I got myself here, I did this. I need to get myself dependent upon God. I need to realize that I am a sinner and I am nothing without the Lord. Are you dependent upon the Lord in every portion of your life? And number two, we also need to look at others properly. You remember the 2 problems that Jesus' followers here in Luke chapter 18 had? They thought that they were righteous in their own eyes, and then they viewed others with contempt. You're not as good as me. Well, here we see that we need to look at others properly. The Pharisee, he looked at the attitudes of others. He looked at those tax collectors. He looked at those adulterers, the unjust, the swindlers. I am so thankful, God, that I am not like these individuals. We can't be that way. Instead of looking at someone and saying, I've arrived and you have not, instead we need to look at individuals and go, I see that you're in sin. I see that you're in sin, much like I, in my past, have been in sin, and sometimes still struggle and still sometimes stumble. Can I help you? Can we walk this life together? Can we finish this marathon together so that we can both enjoy eternity? We can both enjoy heaven with Jesus Christ who saved us together. We need to, of course, get rid of this idea that we are better than anyone else. We need to be looking at others properly. We need to be looking at others that they need mercy, just as I still need mercy. I want you to look at how Jesus finishes the parable. We stopped short in verse 14. Let's read the whole verse again. I tell you this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus used this several times, this particular phrase, this particular proverb, if you will. But the point is, don't be like the Pharisee. Be like the tax collector. Be the sinner who has decided, I'm going to be penitent. I'm not going to be prideful. We're all sinners. So therefore, there's no need for pride. There's nothing that I can exalt myself with. But if I allow God to exalt me, if I allow Jesus Christ to exalt me, then one day I will be with him for all of eternity. Are you going there? Are you going to enjoy eternity? I hope you are. If you're suffering with pride, maybe we can all help each other out. Maybe we can all hold each other accountable and push each other to do more good works for the Lord, but not for our benefit, not for that pat on the back, but rather for the kingdom and helping others get to heaven as well. If there is someone here this evening who's ready to put on Christ in baptism, if there's someone here this evening who's ready to make their life right, if you're wanting to strive to be that penitent individual instead of that prideful individual, if we can do anything for you this evening, will you please come forward as together we stand and sing.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood? trusting in his grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?